Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Andrea and I lead customer experience here at ProdPad. And with me today are Janna Bastow, ProdPad CEO and co-founder of Mind the Product and Product Tank, as well as the one and only John Cutler, product evangelist at Amplitude. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Yep,
Yeah,
thank you.
thanks so much for having us.
It's exciting.
So introduce yourselves because I'm pretty sure we all know who you are, but instead I'm going to do something a little bit different and interesting. Could you guys actually tell me how you got into product management in 15 seconds or less? John, you go first.
Oh, it was an
No
accident.
pressure. No pressure.
My friend told me about the role and I faked it. And then we figured out it was product management after I got in there. Completely
what I did.
Janna,
what about you?
Actually, we were faking it until we faked it until we made it. So it was double fake.
That's
Excellent.
I'm gonna go. With an acceptable answer. Janna, what about you?
Mine's the same. Total accident. I didn't know what I was doing, but I'd had enough experience in a little bit of tech, a little bit of design, a little bit of market customer-facing stuff, and was told by my boss that he liked how I worked and wanted to make me a junior product manager. I was like, great. What is it? Went back to my desk and Googled it and have been trying to figure it out since then.
Good stuff. And you build an entire company around it. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, all of this came out of the fact that I didn't know what I was doing, and so I surrounded myself with product people and started asking questions. And turns out asking questions was a good way to do product management. And, over the years, I've been figuring more and more of it out. But let's be honest, I don't think anybody has it figured out. This is a constant learning thing, which is why we have these conversations.
And that's exactly what we're here, and that's what we're going to do today. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to start answering some roadmap questions. For everyone in the audience today, you see the little questions tab at the top right, or I hope it is. Pop in your questions in there, and we'll be answering them as we go. We also have some pre-source questions, which is what we're going to start with. So the first question is, how would you explain what a roadmap is to someone who's never heard of one? John, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would explain a roadmap as an artifact that you use to have a conversation about the direction you're taking as a company, product direction, to try to elicit feedback that might be helpful for you in terms of setting that direction. And then basically a communication device. I've too many words already, but the first little bit was probably what I'd stick with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. And, I really love talking to people who don't have a preconceived notion of what a roadmap is, because I think there's this history this weight attached to the word roadmap, which comes from the old school way of doing things. And I'm not sure where this came from, but it seems that so many people think of this roadmap as this plan, this perfect document of all the things that are going to be done and when in reality, I agree with John in that it's less about exactly what's on it, but more about being an artifact or a communication document. I actually like to think about it as being a prototype in the same way that, but it's a prototype for your strategy at the strategic level, in the same way that if you were coming up with a new feature idea, you wouldn't come up with this perfect high definition version of that feature and just send it over to the developers. You'd start off with a piece of paper with some junk scribbled on it, and you'd use that as a way to start the conversation about what needs to be done, whether that feature's in the right place or whether it solves a problem. Think about the roadmap as a way of jotting down your assumptions of what needs to go into the strategy or not, and use that as a way to start the conversation going, hey, is there anything missing, or is there anything extra on here that we think isn't useful? So don't worry too much about the exact format of it, but use it as a starting point for just having conversations.
And I actually absolutely love the first question that came in from Lisa. And I'm pretty sure that we can talk about this for the next hour, but we're going to try to keep it short, which is, can you talk a little bit about what a roadmap is versus a project management plan? I'm going to pick on John first.
Oh, you can pick on me. Yeah, so I think what would you notice as the differences? I think that a roadmap would be a little less prescriptive in a lot of situations. The roadmap would probably span kind of multiple initiatives. I mean, there's a lot of people who kind of, very much differentiate projects from product, and I think that they are different things. But a roadmap might really highlight a couple different initiatives on them at once, right? Whereas a project plan might be focused on one particular project that has a very sort of defined box around it. Whereas a roadmap might span multiple potential initiatives that you're thinking of doing. It may or may not have a sequence on it. So I think those are the primary differences. And I think also, remember, like a project plan is a communication document too. It's meant to communicate kind of scope. There's, the triangle of project management. It's supposed to talk about risks. There's a bunch of things that are inherent to doing a project that project sort of document needs to communicate. And roadmaps are communicating different things, communicating direction, the who, the why, in some cases, the how and the what. It's communicating sequence often, or maybe kind of priority. So basically they're communicating different things for different folks and for different outcomes.
Janna?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the two documents are these communication documents, but typically the project plan or the release plan, as I like to think about it, particularly when you're building digital projects, is usually more fine-grained. It's specifically meant for an internal audience, and therefore you will have more detail. Whereas the roadmap is usually that higher level way of communicating the overall plan, so that when projects do come up, they're not a surprise. People know what kind of plans are going to be needed in place. So the project plan will often have much more detail to it. One of the key things I recommend people do, and I think this is one of the sources of confusion for a lot of roadmaps, is that people try to turn them into the same thing, because the project plan, the release plan, represents maybe your next 2 to 3 sprints, as in 4 to 6 weeks out, and should be really detailed, because to be honest, your developers need to know who's going to be working on what and what kind of things are going to be keeping them busy. Frankly, your marketing team needs to know what kind of things are probably coming up soon, so they can start getting plans in place. Everyone needs to know what's happening, like in the right now. Whereas the roadmap can be anywhere from 2 to 5 years, sometimes longer, depending on the company, and does not need that level of granularity that you'd have in a release plan. So separate the two, use them as 2 different documents, because each one is designed around is an artifact for a different type of conversation.
Yep.
I would describe. Sorry, go
I was
ahead.
thinking one thing that I would add to that as well is that, one thing about really good roadmaps is, so everyone knows as a product manager, when you're down in the weeds, someone tells you go up to the high level. When you're high level, someone tells you go down into the weeds. When you're in the middle, someone tells you, it's just, you're constantly switching context. And so that I would say that the best roadmaps allow you to kind of walk that tree, or kind of walk different hierarchies of information really effortlessly. And so typically a project plan, to John's point, is that it's much more sort of specific to a situation. It's not really meant to span these particular like resolutions as quickly. And so that's another major difference that came to mind.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a good roadmap, you should be able to get that high level vision and then drill down and say, okay, so what are we working on now? And that should give you some sort of indication of where to get information on that project that's keeping people busy as they speak. But the roadmap will never have the same level of detail, because there's certain things that happen in a project plan that come down to, like, who is on vacation this week, and therefore what's slowing something down. What 2 features need to be tied together because they're tied against the same library that needs to be updated, or whatever else happens in the development team. They need the autonomy to make the decisions based on that. And, no amount of road mapping is going to solve that. You just need a good project team, scrum master, lead developer, whoever it is who's planning that sort of stuff. And the product manager needs to trust that if they put something on the roadmap, it'll happen in the right sort of order, but that when things get to development, certain things do get changed. You can never, as a product person, perfectly prioritize and say, here's what's going to happen next, and this is what's going to happen. Development is still more of an art than a science, I would say.
Yep. And what I was going to add is that really relates to one of the questions that just popped up, which is outcome versus output. So outcome would be your product roadmap, and your release plan would be your output. And somebody asked, do you think that a roadmap should include both? And I think the answer is, should it? Or to what level should include both outcome and output?
So here's one thing I would say is I've seen some great roadmaps that list options. And I think that this is like a really, really wonderful way to do it. Like people think that there's, you're one or the other on the roadmap. Like you have a very I prefer dealing in kind of very outcome-based, mission-based roadmaps. And I think that works really, really well. But I also respect the fact that there's often like major decisions internally within the company. If a CTO says, can you kind of tell me the direction that you're going? You work with them with the roadmap. But what I find at that point is that it's perfectly fine to talk about kind of potential directions and options you might have to work on those particular missions. And I think if you're working with the right folks who've done this before, that's what they're looking for. As a particular example, I was working with the CTO and they said, well, where is this going in the next 12 months? And I said, well, here's the missions, here's the human problems we're going to solve. And by giving that particular context, then in their mind, they were saying, wow, I see that there's a potential we're going to give major data engineering effort around that. Did you consider that? And I was like, yeah, that's one direction we could take. I want to keep that on your radar. But we don't know. We might be able to solve that problem more easily. And so I think that that's actually exactly the type of conversation you're hoping to have with the roadmap itself. So I think that there's this idea that it needs to be one or the other. And I actually like to talk in terms of options. As things get kind of closer to being actionable, you might list like, well, here's some potential ways we might solve that problem. And so once you build that language around these missions, people tend to fill in the options in their mind anyway. So it just sort of works when you think about it like that. I think that the mistake is the anti-pattern is a 12-month out, highly specific, feature by feature roadmap. And, people say, well, why? Why is that wrong? And really the problem is you're pre-converging on a way to solve the problem, and the world might change, your understanding might change, et cetera, might change. Then again, there are situations like at Amplitude, the company I'm at right now, we have a team called Customer Love. Customer Love deals in very like prescriptive, there's very low uncertainty issues, very low blast radius in the product. There's a list of things we go through when we try to put something on that list. And it's, there's very low likelihood of technical debt. It's not like adding anything new. And honestly, for the customer love list, that's actually pretty ordered and pretty prescriptive. So the idea but then we have mission-based work going on at the same time that goes in tandem. So, there's no right or wrong for that. It's like, what's the nature of the work? And, what do you want to communicate? Hopefully that made some sense.
Yeah, I really like the way that you call it, that terminology, options, because the reality is I find that roadmaps are a mixture of things that have to be done and things that are, more about the experimentation. And I think a good roadmap should give room to communicate both those things, because sometimes there are things that absolutely have to be done. It's a new regulation coming in, or it's a strategically important date, like if we don't launch this by September, we'll miss the starting of school year, and our product is education based, for example. So certain things that you have to put on there saying we don't really have the option. We have to build this thing, and we just need to communicate this and put the resources in the right place to make it happen the best we can. Whereas other things are much more around, here's a problem or an obstacle that we think is in the way that we think we want to tackle. Here's a few ways that we actually might go about doing so. And a lot of people seem to think that a roadmap is diametrically opposed to like being able to experiment because you're locking things down. But the reality is that your roadmap should be flexible enough to give you those options, as John said. The way that I think about it is that on your roadmap, you'll have an area that outlines the scope of the problem and what sort of outcome you're hoping to get. What sort of problem is it going to solve? Is it going to get you revenue or user growth or whatever it is you're trying to do? And then listed alongside that, you'll have the series of things that have to be done and the series of experiments that you're going to be running. And each one of these might be, you might run 5 experiments, you might run 2 experiments, you might list 10 experiments, but only do 2 of them because they worked, or end up doing all 10 because as you're going through, you realize, okay, well, we tried this and it still hasn't moved the right numbers yet. So let's go back to the roadmap and see what else we have in there. And so even though something is in your roadmap and even though it's something you're working on right now, doesn't necessarily mean that you'll do everything verbatim on the roadmap. It's really just there to communicate, like, here's what kind of things we're thinking about doing, or here's where our mind is with this particular initiative and this problem.
You know, one great story that I have with that is that I worked at a company where and I don't know, you probably get this request a lot, like given your particular product, but sales was obsessed with having the roadmap in Salesforce. Like you could literally see like requests listed and had the team acknowledge them and had they done analysis on them and could they put a date on them or not. And, you know, I was trying to empathize, you know, kind of into that. And I sort of saw the need that they were trying to solve. And it was, you know, they just wanted to get a sense of the direction that places things were going. And all it took was a one-day offsite with the folks from sales to talk about how we approached problems. Like that we in that particular company, we tried to make people awesome. That's the way we thought about our roadmap, is whose life are we going to make more awesome? Which kind of persona or actor in the product. And it was really interesting. Like once they grappled with the idea that that's how we did things, and once they saw the track record we have of being able to do things that made them more awesome, it was amazing. It's like this whole thing unraveled. They uninstalled that software. They thought like that didn't work very well. And then what they would say is like, you know, if you can tell me whose life you're going to make awesome, that helps me in sales. And I'm just going to go and talk about the last year of how we've made people's lives awesome. Like we're going to sell what we've done instead of what we expect to do. And it was really, really, really kind of transformational for that thing. And so, you know, back to that particular thing of like what people think they need in terms of the roadmap. And then when you actually explain it in terms that they can understand and it gives them benefit, then that often kind of lets people relax their sort of their need for very prescriptive features. You know, it doesn't work all the time, but like that's a hack that worked for us. And it took a while to unravel, but it did eventually. So.
Yeah, I sort of felt this collective shudder when you said the roadmap being dictated in.
Oh my goodness!
You know what? working with salespeople is one of the best and also worst areas of product management, depending on how you communicate and what your expectations are. You know, we have some people who actively say, "No, I want to hide my roadmap from the salespeople because they're going to sell the stuff that's on there, even though you know it's not ready yet." To which, I mean, the only answer is that you've got to tell your salespeople this is not something you can go out and sell. These are things that you can, if your roadmap is public, sure, you can talk to your customers about what kind of things we aspire to do as a company and make sure that you've got, because that can actually help you win customers if they see what kind of things you're working on. You can help us have conversations around it and validate that we're working on the right stuff. Like if your salespeople keep taking your roadmap and they come back saying, everyone thinks everything we've put on the roadmap is terrible. Like, well, that's feedback for you to maybe change the roadmap, but doesn't mean that they should be taking that and saying, oh, well, I've sold this, this, and this, so you can't change it. Like, as the product manager, we have to listen to a ton of different areas of insight, and it can't just be based on how many customers have asked for something, or even if one powerful customer has asked for something. There's still other things at play that matter to the business.
That actually leads really well into a question that popped in, which is, how do you actually reinforce that the stuff on the roadmap isn't committed and is up for changing? And I think a lot of that relates to business-facing teams that might be saying, yes, we're absolutely going to do that because it's on the roadmap. But then you have to, you know, have the flexibility to say, it doesn't actually mean we're going to do it next or now or right this minute. But yes, it is something that is within the scope of what we aim to solve.
I think that you need to invite people into how your process works and your thought process. And if you do that, and if you do it repeatedly, and in fact, you know, I've had success kind of inviting sales folks into kickoffs and sort of discovery sprints and other things like that too. Like once they understand it, it's not hard. These are smart people, you know, and it's not hard for them to understand how it works. Like a lot of it, you know, what I like to say is that a lot of things about product development are counterintuitive. And we feel that the burden is on, you know, oh, they just don't understand. I mean, this makes the most sense that it could ever, but it's actually flipped around. The way we work is pretty counterintuitive, and the way that they think about it is pretty intuitive going into it. And so if you take that approach, and if you think that you need to kind of guide people into the process and explain how you work, I think that kind of opens up their understanding for how they do it. And it's good. It's sort of like that point that I made before about the salesperson who, shifted from selling the roadmap to selling what we'd done and the problems that we had solved. We only succeeded with that by inviting them in to the process and not kind of keeping them at arm's length. So that's worked for me. Obviously, in some environments it might not work, but I think that's how you get across the void, in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, the roadmap isn't a standalone document that just exists and, you as a product person create this document and send it straight out.
Little kid. Oh, hey, he's taking a bath or something. I might bring him in. That would be really funny. We could have the cutest.
I think that'd be great.
Yeah,
the future product manager.
He has a voice. Sorry, we could keep going. I'm really sorry.
Oh no! And John, if you need to go fetch your little one, don't worry about it.
I mean, there's someone watching him. I haven't put him in the other room.
We're all friends here. It's okay.
All right, keep going. I'll let you know how it goes. I've got a mute button too, so.
No worries.
Sorry.
So yeah, I guess it sort of goes to stand by what you were saying, which is like the roadmap isn't just something that you put in front of people and let them run off with it with all their assumptions. You need to have some sort of communication around it. I like the way that you said it in terms of inviting them in. I've seen people add all sorts of caveats to the roadmap saying, by the way, this is just us trying stuff out. Don't try to make it too fine-grained and perfect. If you've made your roadmap too perfect, it's a little bit like showing a high level, like a really highly detailed prototype of something. People all of a sudden start bickering about what color the buttons are or what font to use or how the spacing looks or something like that, rather than communicating what the individual whether it's solving the proper problems or not. And so your roadmap shouldn't have to be some perfect document that's shiny and untouchable. It should be something that looks like, oh, actually, now that I've shown this to you, maybe we can move some stuff around based on the feedback you're giving us. And it should be accessible in that sense. So I always tell people to take dates off the roadmap, not just because I've never known a single product manager ever hit every last one of their dates that they promised, in their roadmap anyways, but also because doing so gives people this sort of sense of permanence of, this is something that then needs to be delivered upon, and we're not being asked for feedback. We're being told this is what's happening. And that's not what is happening. You're meant to be having a conversation about whether you've got the right problems, whether there's any other assumptions about what should be in your strategy or not.
Yeah. One thing that I actually said is that I actually say that the roadmap continues. It's like it's a continuous discussion, right? And so what I always think is funny is that we hear this a lot at Amplitude. People are like obsessed about prioritization. They're obsessed about getting the roadmap like perfect and doing these things. And then you ask them like, well, do you review your decisions? Like, do you review your product decisions? Do you kind of do a retro on whether the thing that you thought would happen happens? And one thing that back to this question too about part of unlocking this idea that the roadmap is not this sort of contract is also being very open to the organization about what happened. So there's nothing a salesperson or someone in the business hearing you retro a product decision a month or 2 or 3 months after it theoretically shipped and saying, we had pretty good information going into this. We did some research. We learned about it. We actually even iterated a little bit, but feature adoption at the moment is at about 10%. And we've tried a lot of things to try to boost this. And we could have, we might've had more information when we made this decision, or the data might've been a little better, but we're being really honest about where this is at. And so back to that idea that like the roadmap is all of these discussions. And if all you're doing is having the discussion about what goes into the meat grinder instead of like how the sausage tastes or whether it is, then sorry if anyone's vegetarian, I think actually something like then the tofu grinder or something, then you're not actually going to even be able to have a good discussion about the roadmap. So it's multiple discussions that support your roadmap. And this is, people get really mad at me like, well, why don't you just give me an example of this exact roadmap? I advocate for these outcome-based, mission-based roadmaps. And it's so hard to communicate all these other little parts of it that just doing that doesn't get it to you. You need to do the retro of the decisions. You need to have the right discussions. You need to have the right kickoffs. Without those things, it's actually just, a piece of paper or, in your case, like, something in the ProdPad database. So
Yeah.
Anyway, that's something that I thought about.
That's a really good point, and I see that as a bad habit that companies, that a lot of product managers have, which is they'll launch something and then they will remove the item from the roadmap. They'll close all the tickets on Jira, wipe down the whiteboard, and just start working on the next thing, which is really good for keeping up cadence, or at least looking like you're keeping up cadence, and keeping everyone busy, keeping meat going through the grinder, as you will. But it's not very good for making sure that you've actually solved the problem. And so
Yep.
instead of trashing stuff off your roadmap, take that stuff and put that somewhere else. And it's some other, I don't know, third artifact. I've been calling it the validation roadmap. But basically just something that creates a space for you to see, understand what kind of things you released in the past, what you expected the outcome to be, and then compare against that.
Yep.
Check against it maybe 1 week after you launch, and maybe a month after you launch. Maybe you go back to it 3 and 6 months after you launch, and check that the numbers are still stable, or check that it's still solving the problem you set it out to do. And be open to revisiting it, because just because you launched that, I don't know, new checkout flow doesn't mean that everyone's converting exactly as expected. You should be leaving room in your roadmap to say, actually, it didn't work. We hope for a 10% conversion rate. We only got 7. So we're actually going to go run and do this other experiment as well, which we had as one of the options in that roadmap area. And we're going to go back and put that on the roadmap and try it again. And this is one of the really key reasons why you don't want to have some perfectly fleshed out roadmap of things that you're going to be doing, because that doesn't leave you the space or the time or the permission to go back and solve problems in a better way. You end up with a bunch of half-assed projects and that get launched, because the reality is that no feature on its first launch is as good as it could be once it's seen production, you've tested it, you've seen what works, and you've gone back and added more to it, or changed various pieces of it.
It's one of the reasons why I like doing Kanban board based roadmaps versus the linear timeline based roadmaps, because it's very easy to move the card over to like validating, or and you can even have like an explicit column for, I talked about that kind of, I love decision reviews. Like I like creating a safe space for the team to talk about what they knew going into it, what they expected, and even giving a little space like a month or a couple of weeks afterwards, to let it all kind of settle in. But you can be very explicit about those reviews. You can be explicit about when you're going to do those things. And so what it does is it turns it really does make it a roadmap instead of just kind of like an on-ramp or, the destination map to do those things. And I think that's the other thing that reminds me of too, is that I think this might relate to some people's questions, but this idea, this terrible habit that product orgs have of creating this kind of rat race every quarter, or when only your roadmap's only good when someone has bugged you about it. The CEO is like, oh, we're raising money now, the roadmap needs to be good, or someone says we need to know what the roadmap is because we're freaking out about it. It really is a muscle that's integrated in all these rituals and artifacts that you're doing. And, so I like for PMs to always have something that's 12 months out. And that actually trains them to progressively decompose that thing. Like, obviously they're not going to list the feature that they're planning on month 12, but you can think big picture, the next month is more clear, and 12 months from now is those things. So I think that that's another thing that keeps this kind of continuous view of it going versus a sort of feast or famine. Every quarter we're doing OKRs, so we've got to have some crazy roadmap type thing. I mean, it makes it more kind of a regular part of how the organization talks about work versus a once in a quarter type thing, which I think is important.
Yeah, and that actually touches on something that I've seen over the last 10 years of working with roadmaps, and that, back in the old days, pretty much every roadmap just seemed to be this timeline Gantt chart version of tasks to be done mapped against time. And then companies started changing their tack, and you actually saw some companies swing completely the opposite way and say, well, if we can't build a roadmap, then, we're just going to not have a roadmap. We're going to be ultra lean, and we're just going to build things as they come. But that actually results in companies not having the ability to communicate their overall vision, communicate the strategic steps, the big things that are important to them, which means that you end up with companies putting out a lot of features, but not necessarily getting anything solving any real problems. John, I think you coined the term feature factory, where I heard that from you first. Companies are just
I don't
churning
think
out
anything
features.
is original, but it does feel like I wrote a post that was about the feature factory. Yeah, so it feels like,
Okay.
it does feel like a feature factory. It seems kind of derogatory. I mean, since then I've kind of softened on this thing that's like, it's about a sense of impact. That's really the important thing. Like feature factory makes it seem pretty derogatory, but there are cases. I think that the product manager's job is to create coherence around impact and improve decision quality and create context and things like that. So, feature factory things sound, but if you go through the points of the feature factory post, a lot of them are around context building and coherence. Like it's not specific, because sometimes as a PM, you have to build exactly this.
Yeah.
Like there's to suggest otherwise is you probably haven't been doing this for a while if you suggest that everything is an experiment, because that's simply not the case for everything you're doing.
And that's absolutely true. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about how companies need to be more lean and they need to be ready for experimentation and the roadmap is flexible. And the reality is that some companies simply can't operate that way. I mean, there are going to be things on your roadmap that are going to be fixed and that you can't work your way around. I think one of the biggest faux pas in road mapping is having that timeline along the top, because it forces you to put dates against deadlines against every last thing that goes into your roadmap and explicitly say there's a particular order in which things are going to be done. When what you find is that some companies have stuff that needs to be date driven, they're strategically important, or they are regulated, for example. And the more slow and risk averse your company is, the more likely they're going to have these. So maybe 10% of your items in your roadmap have some sort of date set against them, but everything else is flexible, or maybe the opposite. But whatever the case is, don't feel like you need to put dates and give the same level of granularity for every last initiative on your roadmap as you do for the things that are happening in the short term, which you have more visibility over. I like your rule of thumb is saying you want to look out maybe 12 months or so. And that 12 months is rough. I mean, lots of things can happen in that time, but it does force people to look at things that are happening, not just in the immediate term, the sort of panic mode level of things, but also like, what kind of problems do we think we're going to come up with over the next year? What should we make sure people know is important to us? Are there any key dates or milestones or whatever else coming up that we should be aware of? But let's not worry too much about the level of granularity on that. We will get to that when it comes close. Let's focus on what needs to be built here and now and what experiments or options we need to think about.
What about sorry, I was just going to say there's a really good question that popped up here about B2C or SaaS versus B2B. So Chris here is having an issue where his customers are on products that were released 3 years ago. So he's only just starting to get feedback on something that was previously done. So how would you validate or how would you experiment in that sort of environment where, you're kind of, I don't want to say waterfally, but a little bit waterfally?
Oh, wow. That's a big question.
Wow. Look at that. We actually stumped John.
No. I mean, there's so many ways it's okay. So if I'm understanding correctly, you've got this product in the market for a while and you're only getting back to you've got probably a bunch of customer feedback sitting there in like big piles. You have ideas. There's probably someone telling you to enhance the product because they've got to make more money on it now. You've got a lot of competing requests and kind of overwhelmed in that situation to do that. And I mean, Janna will probably say the same. There's no silver bullet. You just kind of have to settle down the situation. And so I think that it's like, if you've got 3 years of customer feedback, this whole thing that like throw out all customer feedback because they never know what they want or anything like that. As a UX researcher, you just have to understand what the nuggets are in that particular bit of feedback, right? So you need to do a large scale affinitization exercise to kind of encapsulate that historical feedback and understand what's going on. And then the second thing about experimenting, like I think in B2B, we find this a lot at Amplitude that people, B2C companies, if you're a game company or you're e-commerce, people are like, oh, of course you need analytics. Like, oh, of course you need it. And then for B2B, they're like, oh, well, no, we don't need it. We don't need those particular things. And so what's kind of amazing to me so the next step I would say is you need to sort of understand the behavioral cohorts in your product. Who's the who? And how is one who different from another who? and who is getting value out of this particular thing. And so anyway, so this could be a really long discussion, but it's a sequence of, you've got to affinidize, get all that customer feedback. You've got to verify who is, what they're doing in your particular product. And the one thing about B2B experimentation, it just looks a little different. It's not this like real time, minute by minute A/B experiment. It might be something like, releasing a super minimal version of something into the product and understanding how people are using it. And in some cases, experimentation can be as simple as like using the analytics in your product to find the 30 people who use the product in a certain way, and then experimenting with paper prototypes with them or doing something like that. Like, experimentation is a huge word. And so people think that the only way you're experimenting is if you're running A/B experiments. And that's just simply not the case. There's gradations of experiments. And I know that we went through a lot of things, but yeah, get all the historical feedback, understand what's going on in your product, and then try to set up experiments that are right-sized for B2B that help you reduce uncertainty and like not ship a lot of crap. So I don't know. That's a huge question.
It is. And, just to expand on something you're talking about, when you're validating, I've talked to a lot of product managers who assume that because they are kind of handcuffed because their development team just for whatever reason isn't able to deliver and launch stuff on the regular basis that some other leaner companies do. That doesn't mean that you're not able to validate stuff or test stuff. I like people to ditch the concept that in order to test something they need to put it out to market, because there's a whole lot of things that need to happen, and it's really, really expensive to build anything that goes into development, into your engineering team. And there's so many ways to validate without actually having to get anything built. You can do things with surveys. You can do things with prototypes, with paper, with just discussions. You can learn so much. You can learn a lot from your analytics or from watching people use your existing product. You can learn from watching people use your competitor's product. There's just so many ways you can learn and validate stuff that doesn't necessarily involve you being tied to the output capability of your development team. And I don't think it's fair to put that pressure on them. I actually don't like A/B tests for a lot of things because people tend to use them for really micro changes when, most of us, we actually need to be testing the bigger changes. An A/B test usually doesn't. An A/B test is often just a really expensive way to disagree. One person says we should do this, the other person says we should do this, and somehow the answer is let's do both. Surely there's got to be better ways than building it twice and then seeing.
I heard a great term the other day called hypothesis.
How do you define that?
I think I got to remember now. Like, the hypothesis is the thing that you're all going to agree on anyway, but that you're going to create a hype, like that what you hope needs to happen, and then you frame it as a hypothesis. I mean, into that thing too. I mean, you do see people approaching experimentation very rigorously with there's a bunch of good reasons to do that way. I think that the big pictures, I think this relates to roadmaps as well, is that. So the really big challenge for PMs is how far upstream to kind of get. And so one situation is if you have something on that roadmap and you're spending you're not even available to your team anymore because you're spending half of your time kind of all the way upstream. And then, you're pushing things down to the team. So I do think it is kind of a balance though. Like, there is some advantage to some of my best moments as a product manager have been deciding not to build anything, but deciding it with engineers, like, hey, we're going to kick off this mission so that we all feel great about it. And the phrase I like to use, it's like in the horror movies when the team opens up the haunted house together, their eyes all bug out together at the same time. Like, you want that feeling from your team. They're excited. They're into getting it. And then, what if after a week or two you decide not to build anything? One of my favorite stories is a company that they were going to do this massive machine learning effort, and they thought it was going to take 8 months or 10 months. And like a day or two in, an engineer said, I think we should just make money tomorrow. And everyone looked at them in disbelief. Like, we're going to make money tomorrow? We can't do that. They're like, yeah, there's people upstairs who can do this in 20 seconds. Like, why do we need to have machine learning solving this problem? I'll just set up this thing that allows the user to like submit the form. And then we'll just start making money on it tomorrow by having people upstairs like approve the form. And then we'll start making money and we'll start learning on doing these things. And I guess the reason why I'm mentioning this is when you're crafting your roadmap, you have to find that balance between relying on your upfront discovery, experimentation sort of work, and then also engaging the team in that particular discovery. Because the problem you have is you could do this sort of paper prototype fake, you could do all these things ahead of time, but if you're dropping all that context on the team at the last minute, sometimes they kind of lose that. They lose the excitement. They lose that sort of, they wanted to be kind of part of that solution, even if it was just using a paper prototype and doing those things. So it's really important when you're framing your initiatives to frame them in a way that engage people in that discovery. Sometimes you can't do it all the times. Like obviously there is a little bit of like that, just delivery happening at that point, but it's helpful to communicate that discovery to the engineers on your team.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that's one of the areas where a roadmap is often useful that people don't really think about, which is that it can actually stop you from ending up down rabbit holes because you're giving the context to the team about, well, here's what problem we're trying to solve. You can actually do yourself a big disservice by over-speccing and saying, here's what I think you need to build. Because oftentimes your engineers know a lot better than you what's possible and how to solve something. And if you dictate, here's exactly what steps you're going to take and what features to go build, there's often the case where one of those features takes up 80% of the time, even though it's actually, one of the least useful, valuable pieces of it. So by giving everyone this context of here's what problem we're trying to solve, somebody can say, oh, actually, this piece right here is way harder to build. Are we sure this is a key thing in solving this problem? Whereas if they're just told this is what to go do, well, they sometimes feel like they just have to run off and go do. It doesn't really lead to that sort of healthy involvement that's needed for building great products.
So guys, sorry to interrupt. I did say that this was going to be 20 minutes and we're 42 minutes in.
You want to do some rapid fire questions? We can answer in like 10 words or less.
10
words or less.
All right.
Must-do tips for creating a good product roadmap. 5 tips. Janna, you go first.
Set a clear vision. Make sure everyone understands what that is. Use something like OKRs or some way of setting objectives so that everything on your roadmap is tied to that. And ditch the timeline. Just ditch the timeline entirely.
John.
My tips would be...
Or actually, you know what? I'm going to give you different questions so we can answer different ones.
There we go. Yeah, because we'll have overlaps.
What do you do when your execs like to talk about delivery, but you're trying to actually show them strategy?
You're not going to change their mind at first. Hack it and talk about both. And then you'll train them to think about both at the same time. You're not going to switch people in one day. So overlap on your roadmap, the themes, the outcomes, the things like that. I like to say, like, you can help anyone craft their output as a bet and then just revisit that bet and do that. So don't try to boil the ocean. Just kind of nudge them in the right direction with the right words, and then people come in line eventually.
Janna, how important is cost versus value when prioritizing roadmap items?
Cost is just this existing underlying thing. Assuming you're not having to hire development teams just to do something and then you get rid of them, it's less about cost. It's about how long something might take. Everything needs to be balanced out in that way, but you should be thinking about your roadmap as you having this fixed set of resources, and therefore what order do things need to come out that's actually going to provide that value. A lot more going on behind there. John, what do you think?
Basically, if you're worried about development team cost or the difference between 1 week, 3 weeks, or 5 weeks, you're probably in a super, super low growth situation. The real important thing is opportunity cost. That's the number one thing. You've got a value creation machine that has the ability to create value at a certain rate. That's a function of the quality of your decisions and the velocity of your decisions. That's what you're playing with, not the cost of 1 sprint or 2 sprints or 3 sprints. People will ask the cost question and then do 10 things at once, which makes everything take 20 times as long. They're obviously not worried about cost if that's the case. You have a pipe of value creation, not a pipe of feature delivery, a pipe of value creation. And so once you wrap your head around that and get people, once you lead talking about value, truly talking about value, then the difference between 12 months and 6 months is important. But I'd like to say I prioritize with only 2 things: super valuable, experiment friendly, and medium to high value, verified small. That's it. You can prioritize with only 2 categories, meaning if it's the most valuable thing the company should be working on, don't be afraid. Try to, if it's experiment friendly, try to be able to extract the value out of this huge opportunity. The second one is medium to high value, verified small. There's some things that just feel we just know that they're small. So you can just do those. Honestly, the middle, don't worry about it. You could spend, I know that's simplistic, but really.
Yeah. That's super interesting. And actually, I'd love to learn and read more about that. John, you write about this stuff a lot. Have you written a blog, or where can we learn more about this?
I'm sure I wrote about that. Like since having a kid, like basically my mental mind map is in all the 400 blog posts. So if you have a question, just contact me on Twitter, and then I'm not cogent enough now to respond.
You'll dig through.
I'll just I'll be that jerk who sends you the blog link.
Perfect.
I've got one last question for both of you. What is the most common mistake you see in product roadmaps nowadays?
Janna, you go first because you know about these things better.
I'm going to say timelines.
Yes, I think that would be the simple answer, having timelines along the top. I'm actually seeing roadmaps changing quite a lot now. I'm seeing one of the issues that I'm still seeing people have is that they're assuming that this roadmap is this one-off document that has to be perfect before they can go and show it to people. They want to finish the roadmap before they show it to someone, which I think is not necessary. You should be showing a half-cut version of the roadmap. Just jot stuff down and get it out there, because that's when you start getting the useful feedback.
Yeah, I would say the biggest mistake I've been seeing for a little bit lately is, when I was doing the consulting, you would go in and you'd sort of say, well, talk about your roadmap. And they might describe like 1 or 2 sort of horizons of thinking. It's basically, oh, here's the big thinking, then here's very, very prescriptive thinking. And I actually think that's the biggest problem that I see, is that in reality, I use this system called 1 to 3. So all work I divide into 1 to 3 hours, 1 to 3 days, weeks, months, quarters, years, and decades. And I think any product manager should be able to go from 1 to 3 hours, the thing that's happening now, to 1 to 3 decades for the company at any given time. If you're cornered in the hall, you should be able to give the current mental model for how those things are related. So what I tend to see in roadmaps lately is people are afraid of making it seem kind of complex or whatever, but they're not nesting these bets appropriately and visually so that people kind of understand there's a messy middle. The now is very, very clear. And the year direction, the kind of fluffy stuff, is very clear too, because you can be clear about really vague stuff. But it's that middle, it's the 1 to 3 quarter bets that are, honestly, it's kind of the realm of middle management sometimes too. They're sort of owning these bets and no one really knows how to talk to them. So the biggest problem I see is coherence across all those ranges. And it's subtle visual cues you can do on the roadmap and other things like that to like arrange it this way. But you should be able to enable that discussion. And if that's the biggest mistake I'm seeing, is the oversimplification of those things and the messy middle problem. I know that's pretty conceptual, but that's like the biggest problem I'm seeing.
Somebody just said, do we really need to end the webinar? Unfortunately, we all have to go at some point. And I said before starting, I'm going to give you guys 20 minutes, but I'm pretty sure we can be here for 4 hours. And we've been here for 49 minutes. So thank you, everyone, for still being here. Anyone that needs roadmap help, I know John does sessions, consulting sessions. Is that right? And you help people kind of go through roadmaps?
Yeah, so at Amplitude, I've got this crazy role where I basically get to do coaching for our customers, but prospects and also the broader product community and stuff as well.
Awesome.
So we set up these like office hours.
Yeah, if you can send that link to us, we'll tweet it out. And Janna and the ProdPad team also does it. We do roadmap clinics. So if you want to keep on talking to our experts, John will sit down with you, Janna will sit down with you, and we also have
maybe we'll combine forces on some coaching hours too. It'll be like
maybe we could. That'd be really. I'm sure that, like I said, we can keep on talking about this stuff for the next like 4 hours. Priyank doesn't want to leave, and I don't think a lot of people here are.
We'll do a marathon one of these at some point too, but you'll just have to like vote it up somehow or whatever. So
24-hour
this has been a lot of fun.
24-hour live stream. I love it. Let's do
Vision
that.
Quest.
Hey, thanks everyone. This has
been thank you, everyone.
Really great questions.
Thank you guys. Thanks, John. Yep. Thanks, Anna. Thank you everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but if you have your questions, tweet at Simply Bastow, tweet at John Cuttlefish, tweet at ProdPad, and we will get back to you.
Oh yeah,
Thanks,
this will be
everyone.
fun. Rest of the day. All right, talk to you soon. All right, bye.
Bye.